The Interstellar Provisions Network had been operating for 372 years without a single complaint being taken seriously. This was considered a stunning achievement in bureaucratic excellence. The IPN delivered nutritionally complete sustenance blocks to every registered sentient being across 47 star systems, each block calibrated to species-specific dietary requirements, each one tasting exactly like compressed disappointment with a hint of artificial berry flavor that no actual berry had ever produced. The system worked on a tier structure because, of course, it did. Premium recipients, usually administrators and council members, received blocks with texture variants. Mid-tier workers got blocks with temperature options. Low-tier personnel got blocks that were technically food in the same way that a pile of wet cardboard was technically shelter. Humans, being the newest members of the interstellar community and therefore the least important, received rations that were charitably described as meeting minimum survival standards and uncharitably described as what happens when you let an AI design food based purely on chemical formulas. Nobody questioned this system. Why would they? The alternative was the barbaric practice of actually preparing food, something civilized species had abandoned roughly around the same time they discovered faster-than-light travel. The very concept of hunting or gathering, or stars forbid, cooking, was considered a quaint historical curiosity, like using paper books or believing in democracy. Station Kepler-7 orbited a gas giant in the Tertius sector, serving as a refueling depot and maintenance hub for commercial shipping routes. It housed 243 sentient beings from 17 different species, all of whom had better things to do than wonder where their food came from. The station hummed with the efficient monotony of a well-oiled machine, which was ironic considering half the actual machines were held together with improvised repairs and desperate prayers. Marcus Webb worked in that strange intersection between official maintenance protocols and creative problem-solving that kept stations like Kepler-7 from catastrophically decompressing. He was human, 42 years old, with the kind of weathered hands that came from years of reaching into places that technical manuals insisted didn't exist. His quarters were small, his pay was smaller, and his patience for administrative nonsense had long since evaporated into the vacuum of space. What Marcus did have was an inexplicable collection of data files from Earth, specifically survival manuals from various historical periods. During his breaks, while other species engaged in their own forms of recreation, Marcus read about trapping techniques from 19th-century American frontiersmen, foraging guides from pre-industrial Europe, and cooking methods that predated the invention of the microwave. His co-workers found this habit somewhere between amusing and concerning, like watching someone study ancient torture devices for fun. The announcement came on a Thursday, which was arbitrary since space stations didn't actually have meaningful weekly cycles, but humans insisted on tracking Earth time zones despite being several light-years away from Earth. Administrator Vexthalan, who resembled a crystalline formation that had achieved sentience and immediately developed an inflated sense of self-importance, delivered the news with the casual indifference of someone announcing a change in printer paper suppliers. Budget reallocations, efficiency improvements, streamlining resource distribution. The corporate terminology flowed like sewage through a broken pipe, and the message was simple: human rations were being eliminated entirely. The cost-benefit analysis had determined that the 3 humans on station could either adapt to alternative arrangements or seek employment elsewhere. The IPN would be suspending their Tier 7 distribution effective immediately. Marcus received this information while shoulder-deep inside waste recycling processor number 4, which had developed a concerning grinding noise that suggested it was trying to achieve consciousness through sheer mechanical spite. His supervisor, a Virulun named Kletch, whose species resembled oversized mantises with better posture, hovered nearby with what might have been sympathy if Rillans had facial expressions anyone could read. "This is unfortunate timing," Kletch clicked, his translator rendering the statement in flat, emotionless standard. "Perhaps you could file an appeal with the council." Marcus extracted himself from the processor, wiping grease on his already filthy coveralls. "How long do appeals usually take?" 14 to 16 cycles. "And how long can humans survive without food?" "I do not have that information readily available." "About 3 weeks, give or take." Marcus picked up his tools, the grinding noise mysteriously having stopped the moment he'd actually looked at it, as machines were prone to doing. "So the appeal would arrive roughly around the time they're shipping my desiccated corpse back to Earth." Kletch's antenna twitched. "That does seem like a design flaw in the appeal process." "Seems like." Marcus walked away, leaving Kletch in that particular state of confusion that came from interacting with humans who didn't react to catastrophic news with catastrophic emotions. The other 2 humans on station, engineers working in the propulsion sector, had already begun packing. They had savings, they had options. Marcus had neither, and more importantly, he had absolutely no intention of leaving. Gormak, the station's security chief, found the situation hilarious. His species, the Korvax, were reptilian bipeds who had evolved from ambush predators and never quite lost their appreciation for watching smaller creatures struggle. He cornered Marcus in the cafeteria, his scaled face splitting into what was probably meant to be a grin, but looked more like a threat display. "So human, I give you 5 days before you're begging Vexthalan to restore your rations." Marcus was examining the cafeteria's food distribution port with the critical eye of someone planning a heist. "That's generous of you. I am feeling generous. Perhaps 4 days. Want to make it interesting? Bet me 20 credits I last 2 weeks without touching the IPN system." Gormak's eyes gleamed. "Done. This will be the easiest credits I've ever earned." Word spread through the station with the speed that gossip always achieved regardless of species. The human was going to starve. The human was too proud to quit. The human was clearly suffering from some kind of psychological break. Speculation ran wild during the brief windows between shifts when beings had nothing better to do than discuss other people's impending misery. Marcus ignored all of it. He had work to do. The first trap went up in Section 7 of the ventilation system, tucked behind an access panel that maintenance protocols said should be checked monthly, but in practice hadn't been opened in 6 months. Marcus had noticed during routine inspections that the squallops, small mammalian pests that had stowed away on a cargo ship 3 years ago and promptly made the station their kingdom, used this particular duct junction as a highway. The squallops were roughly the size of earth rats, covered in oily fur that left residue on everything they touched, and possessed survival instincts that had allowed them to thrive despite numerous extermination attempts. Every species on station complained about them. Nobody did anything about them because dealing with vermin was someone else's department, and that department had been defunded 2 budget cycles ago. Marcus fashioned a snare from salvaged sensor wire, the kind used in proximity detectors that had been replaced by newer models but never actually disposed of properly. The trigger mechanism came from a broken pressure sensor. The frame utilized zip ties, those universal solutions to problems that technically required proper fasteners but would accept creative alternatives. It wasn't elegant, but elegance was for species who had time to worry about aesthetics. He set 4 more traps throughout the station's less traveled areas, each one positioned along known squalip routes. By the end of his shift, Marcus had created a distributed hunting system using materials that cost the station exactly nothing because they were already written off as waste. The hydroponics bay occupied the lower ring of Kepler-7, a sprawling section devoted to atmospheric processing through biological means. The designers had determined that using plants to generate oxygen was more efficient than chemical systems for stations of this size, which meant the bay was filled with vegetation that served exactly one purpose: converting carbon dioxide into breathable air. The Vrillans who managed the bay viewed the plants as machinery that happened to be organic. They monitored growth rates, adjusted nutrient flows, and pruned anything that grew beyond optimal efficiency parameters. The concept that these plants might serve additional functions literally never occurred to them. Marcus walked through the bay during his off hours, which raised no suspicions because crew members often used the space for recreation. The oxygen content was higher here, the humidity more comfortable, and the green growing things provided a psychological benefit that no one could quite quantify but everyone seemed to appreciate. What the Vrillans saw as optimal atmospheric processes, Marcus saw as a salad bar that nobody knew existed. The dandelion equivalents grew in the gaps between primary oxygen producers, dismissed as contamination but tolerated because removing them was more trouble than they caused. Earth dandelions were entirely edible, and these alien cousins shared enough biological markers to suggest similar edibility. Marcus pocketed a few leaves, casually, like someone absent-mindedly picking up trash. The algae in the water circulation system grew thick in the slower-moving sections, forming mats that the automated cleaners struggled to process. The hydroponics crew treated it as a nuisance. Marcus treated it as free protein. In the darker corners, where the lighting systems had been set to minimal output to save power, fungal colonies had established themselves. They weren't supposed to be there, but they weren't causing structural damage, so they'd been labeled as low-priority maintenance issues. Marcus recognized 3 varieties that were definitely edible and one that was possibly medicinal, assuming his memory of pre-space age field guides was accurate. He gathered samples, not enough to be noticeable, just enough to test. If this killed him, well, at least Gormak would lose his bet on a technicality. Day 3 arrived with Marcus still vertical and functional, which apparently constituted breaking news on a station where nothing interesting ever happened. The squalid population had noticeably declined in certain sections, though nobody connected this to the human survival situation, because why would they? The traps were working. Marcus had processed 4 squallips, which was both disgusting and necessary, using techniques he'd read about but never actually practiced. Turns out, skinning an alien rodent wasn't significantly different from skinning an Earth rodent, assuming you didn't think too hard about the existential implications of both. Strange smells began emanating from the human quarters, which were located in a section of the station that most crew members avoided because it was technically habitable but practically depressing. The environmental sensors flagged unusual chemical signatures. Maintenance logged the alerts and did nothing because the readings didn't indicate anything immediately dangerous, and immediate danger was really the only thing that got prioritized anymore. Vex Thalon received a formal complaint from a Centaurian who lived 3 sections away and claimed the odors were disrupting their meditation cycle. The administrator reviewed security footage, which showed Marcus entering his quarters with bags of what appeared to be garbage from the hydroponics bay. This confirmed Vex Thalon's assessment that humans were primitive creatures with incomprehensible behaviors. The situation would resolve itself when the human inevitably collapsed from malnutrition, except Marcus wasn't collapsing. He was actually looking healthier, which was confusing to everyone who'd been tracking his impending demise with morbid curiosity. Kletch approached him on day 5, antenna quivering with what might have been concern. "You appear to be surviving." Appears that way. How? Marcus was recalibrating a pressure sensor because actual work didn't stop just because the station's soap opera was reaching critical mass. Trade secret. The others are taking bets on when you'll break. What are the odds? Currently 3-1 that you'll request emergency rations within the next 48 hours. Might want to put some credits on me lasting longer, just friendly advice. Kletcher's mandibles clicked in what the translator didn't even attempt to interpret. You are either remarkably resilient or suffering from cognitive impairment that's affecting your judgment. Why not both? Day 7. Marcus had accumulated enough foraged materials to attempt something ambitious. His quarters contained a small kitchenette that previous human occupants had installed, complete with a heating element that technically violated station safety codes but had been grandfathered in through bureaucratic oversight. He'd supplemented this with a plasma cutter set to its absolute lowest setting, which created a heat source that could be controlled with terrifying precision if you didn't mind the occasional shower of sparks. A coolant container, thoroughly cleaned and repurposed, served as a cooking vessel. The station's recycling system had provided various metal implements that could function as utensils with only minimal risk of heavy metal poisoning. Marcus began to cook. The process was equal parts chemistry, archaeology, and desperate improvisation. The squalid meat required slow roasting to break down the muscle fibers into something approaching tenderness. The foraged greens needed blanching to reduce the bitter compounds that made them unpalatable raw. The fungal samples, after careful testing had confirmed they wouldn't immediately kill him, could be dried and ground into something resembling flour. The algae was the trickiest component. It needed to be processed to remove the natural toxins that prevented it from being eaten by the station's aquatic maintenance fauna. Marcus boiled it 3 times, changing the water between each cycle until it reached a consistency that was only moderately horrifying. As he worked, the aromas began to spread. Kepler-7's ventilation system was designed for efficiency, which meant it was very good at distributing air throughout the station. What it wasn't designed for was filtering out the complex organic compounds created by cooking food, because nobody had cooked food on the station in its entire operational history. The smell of roasting meat hit the air circulation system like a biological weapon. Species who had never experienced the concept of cooking suddenly found their olfactory senses overwhelmed with information they had no context to process. The vrillons detected complex protein chains breaking down and restructuring. The Korvax recognized prey animals being consumed, triggering ancestral memories they didn't know they had. The crystalline species detected thermal energy being applied to organic matter in ways that seemed deliberately inefficient and therefore deeply suspicious. Alarms didn't go off because there were no alarms for someone is preparing food. But emergency protocols were consulted. Security meetings were convened. Gormak pulled up schematics, trying to locate the source of the contamination, because that's what everyone was calling it now, contamination. The trace led directly to Marcus Webb's quarters. Gormak assembled a response team, which was excessive for investigating a single human but appropriate for what everyone assumed was either a chemical leak or the preliminary stages of a biological attack. They approached the door with weapons drawn, because training and paranoia made for strange bedfellows. The door opened before they could override it. Marcus stood in the doorway, completely unfazed, wearing an apron he'd fashioned from a maintenance tarp. Behind him, the quarters had been transformed into something that didn't belong on a space station, a dining area with an actual table, actual chairs, and actual plates containing actual food. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Marcus asked, as if armed security teams showed up at his door regularly. Gormak's weapon lowered slightly, confusion overriding training. What is that smell? Dinner. What is dinner? A meal, food, sustenance consumed during the evening cycle. You know, basic biological necessity stuff. The security team stared. Marcus had set a table for one, but the spread suggested he'd been expecting company or had simply lost all sense of portion control. Roasted squallop, the meat dark and glistening, sauteed greens that actually looked green instead of the grey-brown of processed nutrition blocks. Something that resembled bread, though it was denser and darker than any bread the team had encountered. A soup made from algae that had somehow transformed from pond scum into something with actual color and texture. "You're eating the station's pest population," one of the security officers said. Statement or accusation, hard to tell. "I'm solving the station's pest problem while addressing my own nutritional requirements. It's called efficiency." Marcus gestured to the table. "Want to try some? I made extra." This was clearly a trap, or insanity, or both. Gormak activated his communicator. "Administrator Vexthalen, you need to see this." The administrator arrived with the kind of speed that suggested he'd been monitoring the situation closely, which he absolutely had been. Vexthalen's crystalline structure refracted the light in Marcus's quarters, creating rainbow patterns across the walls that would have been beautiful if the situation weren't so bizarre. "Explain yourself," Vexthalen demanded, which was how he started most conversations. Marcus pulled out a chair. "I'm eating. You eliminated my rations. I adapted. That's pretty much the whole story. You are consuming unprocessed biological matter. Technically, I processed it quite a bit. That's what the cooking was for." "Cooking." Vexthalen pronounced the word like it physically hurt. "You engaged in primitive food preparation. My people used to do it back when we were too stupid for food synthesizers. Turns out, it still works." Marcus picked up what appeared to be a leg from the roasted squallop, bit into it, chewed thoughtfully. "Pretty good, actually. Little gamey, but you work with what you have." The assembled aliens watched in horror as the human consumed food that hadn't been rendered into uniform blocks and analyzed for nutritional completeness. This was like watching someone perform surgery with a hammer. It violated every principle of civilized society. And yet, Marcus was clearly thriving. His skin had better color than it had shown in months. His energy levels were obviously higher. The medical scans that Gormak had pulled up on his datapad showed improved biomarkers across the board. "I cannot allow this to continue," Vexthalen said, with the authority of someone who definitely could not stop this from continuing, but hoped saying it firmly would change reality. "Which part? The part where I'm not dead? Or the part where I'm solving problems using available resources? The part where you're violating health and safety protocols? Show me which protocol." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "I checked. There's nothing in station regulations about food preparation because nobody thought anyone would be primitive enough to do it. Legal loophole. My favorite kind." Kletch had arrived at some point, drawn by curiosity and the complex smells that his species found simultaneously repulsive and fascinating. "May I ask a question?" "Sure. How does it taste?" The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Vexthalen's structure flickered with what might have been anger. Gormak's hand moved back toward his weapon, though what he planned to shoot was unclear. The other security officers shifted uncomfortably. Marcus smiled. "Want to find out? That would be highly inappropriate." Vexthalen interjected. But Kletch was already moving toward the table, antenna quivering with scientific curiosity that overrode social programming. "I have never tasted food that wasn't processed. The concept is foreign to me. Everything's foreign until you try it once. Marcus pushed a plate toward the virulon. Start with the greens. They're mild. Kletch picked up a leaf with his manipulators, examining it with the intensity of someone diffusing a bomb. Then, with the commitment of a being who'd already decided that understanding was worth the risk, he consumed it. The reaction was immediate and complex. Kletch's entire body went rigid. His antenna shot straight up. His mandibles clicked rapidly in a pattern that the translator gave up trying to interpret. For a long moment, everyone thought the virulon was having a seizure. Then Kletch spoke. His voice modulated in ways that suggested profound confusion. This has flavor. Most food does. No, you misunderstand. This has multiple flavors. Simultaneously. That change as I process them. Kletch reached for another piece. Our nutrition blocks have one flavor. Uniform. Consistent. This is chaos. Delicious chaos. Marcus offered. One by one, with varying degrees of reluctance and curiosity, the others tried samples. Gormak approached the roasted squalip with the caution of someone approaching a bomb, his predator instincts warring with his civilized sensibilities. When he finally tasted it, his pupils dilated to twice their normal size. "This is what meat is supposed to taste like," he said, wonder and horror mixing in equal measure. "We've been eating lies." The security officers tried the soup, the bread, the various components that Marcus had assembled into a meal instead of a nutritional delivery system. Each one experienced the same cognitive dissonance. This was wrong according to everything they knew, and yet it was somehow more right than anything they'd eaten in their entire lives. Only Vexthalane refused, standing at the edge of the gathering like a disapproving parent watching children play in mud. "This proves nothing. You've created a temporary solution to a problem that wouldn't exist if you'd simply accepted the council's decision." True. Marcus started cleaning up, because even in the middle of a cultural revolution, dishes still needed washing. Of course, now everyone knows this is possible. Word's going to spread. People are going to have questions. What questions? Like why we've been eating processed blocks when actual food exists. Like why the IPN has a monopoly on nutrition when stations are sitting on resources nobody's using. Like why my rations got cut when I'm clearly providing more value than anyone realized. Marcus dried a plate with a rag that had definitely been a work towel yesterday. Just thinking out loud, Vexthalane's structure dimmed, which was apparently how crystalline beings expressed the emotion of realizing they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. You cannot possibly prepare food for the entire station. Didn't say I could, but I could teach people. Run a side operation. Maybe charge a small fee for premium ingredients. Marcus grinned. You know, adapt to market conditions. The implications crystallized faster than Vexthalane could formulate objections. If word spread that one human had survived, thrived, even by abandoning the IPN system, questions would be asked. Investigations might be launched. The carefully maintained monopoly on food distribution could face scrutiny that would reveal just how much profit the IPN extracted from what should have been a basic service. And if other species learned that food could taste like something other than compressed sadness with artificial flavoring, the entire economic model collapsed. Gormak was still eating, having moved past sampling into full consumption mode. Human. About that bet. Yeah? I'm willing to call it even if you teach me how to do this. Deal. Kletch had taken notes on his datapad, scientific method overriding every other consideration. I require detailed instructions on the preparation process for research purposes. Sure thing. Vexthalane watched his authority evaporate in real time, which would have been satisfying to observe if Marcus had been the vindictive type. He wasn't particularly. This was just survival with style points. 6 months later, Station Kepler 7 operated under a new informal economy that existed in the grey spaces between regulations. Marcus still worked maintenance, because those machines weren't going to fix themselves, but his schedule had been adjusted to accommodate his thriving side business in what was now officially termed alternative nutritional preparation. The squalid population had stabilized at levels that were manageable rather than infesting, because they had a natural predator again, humans and anyone else Marcus had taught to hunt. The hydroponics bay had expanded, with the Vrillans grudgingly admitting that multi-purpose plant cultivation was more efficient than single-purpose atmospheric processing. Certain species had discovered that they actually enjoyed the process of preparing food, which was causing minor existential crises across multiple decks. Vexthalane had been reassigned to a desk job in a sector where his particular talents for bureaucratic inflexibility could be properly appreciated, which was to say, somewhere far away from anyone who mattered. The new administrator was a pragmatic sort who recognized that happy crew members were productive crew members, and crew members eating real food were significantly happier than those choking down nutrition blocks. The IPN had launched an investigation into unauthorized food preparation on Kepler 7, which had immediately gotten bogged down in legal definitions of what constituted food preparation versus personal resource management. The investigation was now in its 4th month and had produced 17 committee reports, none of which agreed on basic terminology. Marcus had expanded his operations to include cooking classes, which were now the most popular recreational activity on station. He'd also started a small garden in his quarters, which technically violated space utilization regulations, but which the new administrator had decided to classify as essential mental health equipment. Gormac had lost 20 pounds and gained a new appreciation for proper seasoning. Kletch had written 3 research papers on the psychological benefits of flavor diversity. The other species had formed something resembling a food culture, with recipe exchanges and competitions that got surprisingly heated, given that everyone involved had been eating identical blocks 6 months ago. And Marcus still set traps in the ventilation system, because squallops bred fast and you could never be too prepared. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, back when the IPN thought they could starve out a human by cutting rations. They'd forgotten that humans had survived on Earth by being the most persistent, adaptable, and creatively stubborn species evolution had ever produced. Turned out, those skills translated pretty well to space stations. Marcus checked trap number 7, which had caught another squallop during the night cycle. He reset the snare with practiced efficiency, already planning the evening menu. Maybe a stew this time. The Centaurians had been requesting more liquid-based dishes, and he'd found a new fungal variety that added excellent umami depth. The station hummed around him, efficient and functional, and now, improbably, home to something resembling actual cuisine. Not bad for a maintenance technician who'd simply refused to accept that someone else's budget calculations should determine whether he ate or not. He whistled as he worked, an old Earth tune that nobody else on station would recognize, and headed back to his quarters. There was cooking to do, and life to live, and a whole station full of beings who were slowly discovering that sometimes the primitive way was the better way. Somewhere in a distant office, an IPN administrator reviewed reports about declining nutrition block consumption on station Kepler 7 and tried to figure out what had gone wrong. They would never understand. The answer was too simple and too human. When you try to take away someone's food, You'd better make sure they don't know how to get more. Marcus knew how to get more. He always had. And he'd made sure everyone else knew it too. The humans had won this round, not through superior technology or advanced science, but through the lost art of being resourceful, stubborn, and willing to eat the local wildlife. It was the most human victory imaginable, practical, slightly gross, and absolutely effective. And the food actually tasted good, which was just a bonus.